All right. So let's start with a little Q&A. If I asked you to stand on one foot and tell me what is the Book of Esther about, what would be your answer?
Survival in the diaspora.
Survival in Esther. Not a bad summary. Okay, I'll accept that. Uh, Anybody else?
Well, to coin the old joke, they tried to kill all of us, they only killed some of us. Let's eat.
Well, they didn't kill any of the Jews, actually, as far as we know.
Rabbi, I think you may have to, I don't know if you've already started, but I think some people, for some reason, the links weren't connecting. So we got into my Mondays a bit late. So people are probably coming over.
Okay, so you didn't miss much because I've just sort of started with a little Q&A, which is if you had to describe the Megillah. And what I think Des Friedland wanted to say was the following. He said, they tried to kill us, God saved us, let's eat.
Right, okay.
I think that's the version. Am I wrong?
No, that's right.
Right. So, yes, Jonathan.
No, it was an error. I was just renaming myself. I apologize, Rabbi. I'm going to quit causing trouble. Thank you for doing this.
Okay, so as you heard, that we're pausing a little bit for technical difficulties. There's some people who haven't or still logging on because of some problems in the links. So we're just pulling in some new folks. Okay, and apologies again on the schedule change. It was just one of those things that you can't plan, because we had it was a Shiva house that got scheduled against this. Sometimes those things happen. Okay, so I asked everybody here, what is the Megillah about? If you had to stand on one foot, and the answer that we got was the Megillah is about the idea of survival in the diaspora. And then another answer that we had was they tried to kill us, God saved us, let's eat. Anybody else want to throw out a one last attempt before I try and share some of my thoughts on this?
I think part of it is don't wait for the last minute to do something.
Okay, all right. That will certainly come up. Okay, so just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second to get that working, and you see one slide, not two, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. All right. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just a very simple and interesting analysis, and that's Megillah by the numbers. The Megillat Esther, is unique amongst the books of the Bible because Hashem is missing. There is no reference to God's name in the entirety of the Megillah. And just as an example, the Achashverosh, or the word Hamelech, appears 200 times in the Megillah. God, it gets 0. Now, you may think, okay, that's not such a big deal, but there's an interesting comparison. There's a famous Jewish text known as the Septuagint, or the Targum Shivim. The Septuagint was a translation that was commissioned by King Ptolemy of Alexandria, when he asked 71 rabbis to all simultaneously in separate rooms translate the Torah. And the rabbis did so, and there were certain perversions to the Torah that the Talmud decries, but miraculously all 71 rabbis agreed on the translation of this text. And the text that we have has some religious authority, even as the Talmud says it doesn't like it. But if you look at the Septuagint on the Book of Esther, God is mentioned over 50 times in the Septuagint. What that tells you is that the author of the Megillah worked very hard to make sure that the name of God was missing from the Megillah, and that's a deliberate choice, and that's a choice that is not an irreverent choice. Deborah said that the theme of the Megillah is survival in the diaspora. Well, when you live in the land of Israel, it is the place where God's eyes are on it always, and it is the land of the Jewish people. But as you move into the diaspora, there are all sorts of, I don't want to say competing forces, because you can't be a competing force with God, but the politics seem to be different, and you might come to the perspective that that God is absent in the in the diaspora. The Megillah comes to tell us, you know what? Actually, you will find God in the Megillah, but it's taught in a very artful fashion. So let's start off with Achashverosh as a king. So Achashverosh is a main character in the Megillah, right? As we said, he's mentioned 200 times, and what's interesting about the Megillah is that the Megillah begins with Achashverosh and ends with Achashverosh. If you look at the last chapter of the Megillah, you would think that, okay, after the Megillah, let's take the Des Friedland theory. Des, you want to repeat your theory again?
Well, you softened it. So I'll
okay, so they tried to kill us. God saved us. Let's eat. So the Megillah ends, but we could have well ended the Megillah with the following. It says, Vatichtov Esther Hamalka, but Esther, the queen, wrote all of these things, and that you should keep all of the laws of Purim, and she sent out letters to all of the Jewish communities so they would know what to do. And then it says, finally, almost the last paragraph, it says, Umamar Esther kiyam divrei Purim ha'ela v'nichtav b'sefer. So the words of Esther, the protocols of Purim, were written in a book, and they've been kept. Good. Now, we could have ended the Megillah there. The Jews they tried to kill us, check. God saved us, check. Let's eat, check. Let's plan the party for next year, check. Right? We should finish the Megillah at that point. There's nothing else left to say, right? Should be no other piece. Last 3 verses of the Megillah, chapter 10. It says, and King Achashverosh placed a tax on the land and all the islands of the sea. Right? And then it goes on to tell us, and all of these things were because of the efforts of Mordechai, etc., etc. Why does the Megillah have to tell me about Achashverosh's tax policy? That's the end of the Megillah? What is that doing there? That's such an afterthought. So, one thing the Megillah is showing you here, it is showing you that Achashverosh is the main character in this book, and the story, as much as it might seem about the Jews, is really about what? Or let's peel back a layer from the story of the Jews. What sits just right when you pull the wallpaper off from the story about the Jews? What's underneath that wallpaper? What's underneath that wallpaper is the story of Achashverosh's treasury, right? At the beginning of the story, he's got to spend money. He displays his riches. He's maybe a king who has tenuous power. So, what does he do? He spends money, invites everybody to a party. Lavishly, he pads his his kingdom. He wants to gain authority. The end of the Megillah is about the fact that now that he has stabilized himself, he can raise taxes. That's the goal. In a sense, that's the goal of all despots, right? Be able to fill the treasuries. So what you see with Achashverosh, if you take the supposition that Achashverosh is the main character, all of a sudden there is a set of politics that really motivate behind this story. Now there is a fascinating duality that we will see in the structure of the Megillah. Everybody has a counterpart, right? You have Esther, and Vashti, right? Now, what happened to the first queen?
She got next.
Yeah, exactly.
Closed
She got
out.
next, right? She got gone, right? So Esther knows that it's a very precarious situation, and she quite literally fills the role of Vashti. Then you have Haman and Mordechai. Is there a sense that Mordechai will replace Haman in this book?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. The ring goes from Haman's hand onto Mordechai's hands. The power of the kingdom goes from one vizier to another, right? And not only that, there's this ironic scene where Haman thinks that he's going to be built up, but who gets built up in his place? It's Mordechai. So you see this very interesting structure where everybody has a counterpart. Who doesn't have a counterpart in the book? Achashverosh. And so it makes a lot of sense to say that Hashem is sort of the background counterpart to Achashverosh, the invisible duet to his character in the story. Now, this is where I think things are really fascinating. What's Achashverosh's first law? What's the first law he passes? Nobody knows? Okay, well, the first law that Achashverosh passes is he uses this massive system of communication, this Pony Express that he's got that goes to all of his 127 nations in their own language, and you have to write it officially, right, and sent out with these horse riders. Every man shall be the boss in his household. Now, this is a very odd law to pass because its enforceability is suspect, right? How are you gonna if your wife decides that she wants fish for dinner instead of chicken, is that an executable offense? Who's policing this, right? It's a meaningless law. It's almost a joke that he passes this law, and so you get this sense of this king who passes meaningless laws. The counterpart with God is, of course, that we see God's laws as the deepest meaning, as honor your mother and father, the laws of thou shalt not kill. You can take the laws of the Torah and you compare them to this king, and he looks like a blithering idiot. But the way in which characters revolve around the king is almost entirely parallel to the way that people will revolve around God. So all of the characters are dependent on the goodwill of the king. Haman, Esther, right? Everybody's constantly trying to assess or placate the moods of the king. And the king's moods are very determinant in terms of how things go out. It's a contrast because this sense is that you don't have a king who is governing by law, but rather by emotional disposition. But coming back, this I didn't realize this until it was pointed out by Rav Yoel Binun. It's fascinating, right? Esther can't enter Achashverosh's chamber unless he gives her permission. And if she should approach the chamber without permission, what's the punishment?
Death.
Death.
Death. Now, this is a very interesting parallel, right? In terms of God's, if God had a throne room, it might be the Holy of Holies. And you can't go in there except once a year, right? In a sense, with the king's invitation. And this even has an echo in the liturgy, the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah. The liturgy of Rosh Hashanah, in the extended blessing of holiness that we read on Rosh Hashanah, each paragraph begins with the word uvechein. I will just annotate it here. Again, unfortunately, because of the funeral, I had less time to prepare slides than I usually do. But this is the word uvechein, right? And it is this word that Esther uses to describe going into the chamber of Achashverosh. The Kedusha of Rosh Hashanah uses this word 4 times to reinforce the concept that we Jews on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're trying to enter the Holy of Holies. So this Megillah has this uncanny connection that sort of puts Achashverosh into this position which would normally be occupied by God. Now here's where the book of Esther is particularly artistic in its presentation. There's a wonderful article called, I think it's called Many Thoughts in the Hearts of Man, Irony in the Book of Esther by Moshe Simon, a friend of mine. And Moshe Simon wrote this as his, I think it was his undergraduate thesis in Princeton University. And what Moshe did was he looked at the idea of irony and its definition. And in particular, the definition of irony that he uses is when a character is working on a certain assumption of facts, and the storyline comes to undermine the worldview of that character. And what is interesting in the Megillah is that every single one of the characters is going to be stung by the irony of the book. Achashverosh is, as we mentioned, he's stung in the very first chapter, because here is a king who is, the king of 127 nations, and he's very wealthy and all of those things, but his laws are just, they're farcical. If you read the first chapters of the Megillah, it says, V'hashtiya kedat. The drinking was according to the law. There was a law about how much you were supposed to drink at the party. These are ridiculous things to have laws about. People don't need laws about how to drink. They tend to do it naturally. When Achashverosh is upstage by his own recalcitrant queen, right? This is Achashverosh's power move. I'm going to show off Vashti to everyone. And it turns out that Vashti is not interested in playing by his rules. Here he is showing all of his power. And guess what? The queen herself undermines his power. What is the mechanism that he uses to regain his footing? To send out a completely unenforceable law that every man should be the master in his own house. It is a farcical use of the power and the structure of being the king. Haman, let's take him next. Haman is famously struck by irony in several different ways. Number one, how does Haman die?
He gets hung.
He gets hung. And where does he get hung?
On the tree that he prepared, on the gallows that he prepared for Mordechai.
Right. You ever heard the term hoisted on his own petard? Well, Haman didn't have a petard. He just had a gallows. And so he is literally hung on the gallows that he built himself. right? So that is a very bitter irony. Haman is also struck by the irony of the book, because while Haman is constantly sort of the real politic, the master politician, the person moving behind the scenes of politics, seemingly be able to manipulate the king's emotions. How does Haman? What crime does Haman get hung for?
Well, treason,
No.
trying to.
Nope. After the treason, right?
It's trying to Kuchi Esther.
Yeah.
Correct. Trying to seduce the queen is, I think, the term in the law schools. I don't think they use the kuchi, but Lichboshet hamalka imi babayit. Are you going to vanquish my queen with me in the house? Says Achashverosh. So Haman is actually outplayed in politics by a schoolgirl, by Esther. So that's how Haman meets his death. He's not nearly as crafty as all that. The irony bites him. And the most ironic moment of the entire Megillah, of course, is when Haman is asked, how would you honor someone the king wants to honor? And guess who? And Haman is certain that he's being honored. And so he transparently says, you know what, dress me up in the king's robes and put me on the king's horse and parade me through the town, letting everybody know that this is how you honor someone who the king wishes to honor. Guess what? It's Mordechai, your arch enemy, the guy you're trying to kill. He's the one who gets the honor, right? So again, Haman is scorched by the irony of this book. Even Esther, by the way, is also scorched by the irony of the book. How is that so? So Esther, there's a decree that happens. This decree that that the Jews are going to be exterminated by Haman, and the decree goes out. Esther is cloistered in the palace. She doesn't know of this particular edict, and Mordechai shows up at the palace gates wearing sackcloth and ash. And Esther's like, Mordechai, get a copy of Vogue. You need to know what is the right attire for the king's court. You can't show up dressed like that. And Mordechai says, well, you think this is how I dress because I want to? And Esther even sends Mordechai new clothes. So the irony of the book even touches Esther. The one person who never gets touched by the irony of the book is the one person who is called Ha-Yehudi, right? The person who sort of, if you will, he touches Yehudah, he touches Judea. He is the locus to Torah, to the history, to the story and the ethics of the Jewish people. The Mordechai, throughout the book, he is associated with the word yada, to know, and the irony of the book never ever touches him. And so the way in which irony functions here is to suggest that we operate in a world where we think that kings and ministers govern things and they're really in control. And then the Megillah wants to tell you, that the arc of history is not governed by these people. It is governed by Hashem. And so that's an important piece here, that we're meant to, especially when we live in the diaspora, we're meant to view with skepticism the machinations of government, the motives of kings and viziers, and we're meant to only really trust Hashem. Now, I would be remiss, and I think anybody who studies the Megillah would be remiss if they don't focus on one key moment in the Megillah. And this is the moment of choice in the Megillah. Mordechai has said to Esther, a decree has come out, and you're going to have to speak to the king on our behalf. And Esther says, well, don't you know it's very dangerous to go and see the king, and if he doesn't welcome me, I'm dead, right? You know what happened to the last girl in this job. So Mordechai then says, I have the, sorry, wrong slide. Okay. It says, Vayagidu leMordechai et divrei Esther. So they told Mordechai Esther's response, I'm afraid to go, right? It says, Vayomer Mordechai lashiv el Esther. Mordechai said back to Esther, Al tidami benafshech limalet beit hamelech mikol haYehudim. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. Ki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. If you remain silent at this time, revach v'hatzala yamol haYehudim mimakom acher. Safety and relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. At uveit avich toved. And who knows? Perhaps for this reason you attained to royal position, just for this kind of crisis. This is sort of that gut check moment where Mordechai teaches us something very, very important here about Jewish history. It says, there is no guarantee that you, Esther, will escape from this trouble. I don't care how high up you are, how powerful you are, what crown you wear on your head. That doesn't matter. What I can guarantee you is that God will save his people. That one way or another, God will figure out a way to save the Jewish people. But this is your moment. This is your moment. You know, you have to take the opportunity because you don't know if this is, in a sense, your life's purpose. And this idea of im hacharesh tacharishi, if you remain silent now, God will save his people, but I can't guarantee what's going to happen to you. And the Esther's response is as follows. Vatomer Esther lashiv el Mordechai. This is what Esther said to say back to Mordechai. Lech knos et kol haYehudim, gather in all of the Jews. Hanimtziim b'tzushana b'Rab tzumu alai, all of the Jews, and fast for me. V'al tochlu v'al tishtu shloshet yamim laila v'yom. Fast for 3 complete days, day and night. Gam ani v'narotai atzum kein. I and my maidens will do the same. Uvachein. This is that word that I told you about. Uvachein avo. Uvachein avo el hamelech. And with this I will go to the king, asher lo kedat, which is against the law. V'chasher avadati avadati. And as I am lost, I am lost. So the simple meaning of those words are, I'm going to throw caution to the wind. I'm going to trust God. And if I die, I die. But at least I die trying to save my people. At least I die with purpose. I'm going to come back to these words in a few minutes, and you're going to see how the rabbis read this, because I think it gives us a deeper understanding of Esther's level of sacrifice. But before I do that, I want you to see Esther in the context of a story pattern, which is very important. There are 3 very similar stories in the Torah, and they are the story of Esther, Daniel, and Joseph. Now, you'll see here it's Daniel, Joseph, and Hadassah. The reason I have it that way is just otherwise it doesn't organize properly, because you might know her as Esther, but her Hebrew name is really Hadassah. And so let's look at Joseph. He's the most familiar to the story to all people. Joseph's given name is Joseph. In Egypt, though, the Pharaoh will give him a non-Jewish name, right? And that is Tzafnat Paneach. This column is the non-Jewish name column. Then, interestingly, about all of these characters, they have sleep-related issues. There are many dreams in the Joseph story, and Joseph interprets many of them. All of these individuals are orphans, right? Joseph is away from his father for 21 years in the land of Egypt, right? So now you see this pattern. You have an orphan child or a near orphan child who interprets dreams, who is has a non-Jewish name and is a member of the high court of wherever they live. And each one of them has a challenge. And Joseph's challenge is Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. And Joseph is sitting there, and the Talmud says he almost got caught. That it says, la'asot malachto, he went to do his work. So one of the rabbis of the Talmud says do his work does not mean the dusting. It means that Joseph was near being seduced by Potiphar's wife, but he resists. He resists. The Medrash says that he saw the face of his father, and that riveted him into proper behavior. So Joseph's challenge was the challenge of sexual immorality. Now let's go to the story of Daniel. Most people are less familiar with the story of Daniel. Daniel belongs to a period of time where the Jews are exiled under Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and he places him in the ward of the eunuchs. And the eunuchs are meant to feed these young boys and sort of groom them. And Daniel has a non-Jewish name. His name is Belshazzar. And he also interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and Daniel is also an orphan. But Daniel's test is that he refuses to eat the food of the Babylonians. Now, you may think that there's nothing, the food challenge is nothing compared to Joseph's challenge. I mean, seriously, come on. You decided to live on seeds instead of eating the palace food, and Joseph had to resist the voluptuous and beautiful Potiphar's wife. Come on, that's not even a fair fight. But you have to understand that food for the Torah is the lubricant of assimilation, right? It is the WD-40 of assimilation. That's what food is. And it is the identity of the Jewish people. That's why there's a whole mitzvah of kashrut. And so the resistance of food, of keeping kosher in the diaspora, is a fundamental of preserving identity. This, to me, by the way, viewed in this rubric, the story of Esther leaps off the page. Because, so Esther's Hebrew name is really Hadassah. Esther is Ishtar. It is a Babylonian goddess, right? Interestingly, in her story, the king has trouble sleeping. He lies awake. Esther is also an orphan. We know that Mordechai had adopted her, or at least was her ward. She was Mordechai's ward. But what is Esther's challenge? Esther's challenge is not seduction and is not food. It is silence. It is the failure to stand up when the moment comes. And I think that that's such an important piece of Esther, because when you make this a story about if the main character of the story is Achashverosh, and everything seems, when the sort of the original casting of the story, the original painting is all king, and God is sort of like the Where's Waldo of this story. Well, where's God? I can't find him in the story. It's hard to make sense of this, hard to understand God's plan in the middle of this very strange political drama. And the story is filled with irony and shifting sands. And do I bet on the Hamans? Do I bet on the Achashveroshes? Do I bet on the Esther? And even Esther's not sure because she doesn't even understand all the politics. And Mordechai says to her, look, there's only one job here. And that job is to believe that God is going to protect his people. And it's your job to stand up to them however you can. And so Esther's great challenge is silence, is not championing her people. And I think that when I think about the Book of Esther in this rubric, to me it just leaps off the page and speaks very loudly about this whole story. I want to, though, turn the heat up on this another notch.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Um, I don't know why it comes to mind, but wasn't there a similarity a little bit with Jonah, who also didn't want to carry out what Hashem asked him to do?
Interesting. For different reasons. Jonah's problem was he didn't think the Ninevites should be forgiven, so he thought he knew better than God. Esther is silent out of fear, not out of judgment.
Okay, thanks.
So I think those are a little different, but that's worthy of a study on its own. So I will give you that.
Thanks.
Well, it's not fitting into my pattern, so I'm not sure if we'll work on that tonight. Okay, now I want to turn the heat up on this whole deal again. Let me clear my drawings. Okay, these words, "V'chasher avadati avadati." The Talmud reads those terms as follows. The simple understanding is, if I perish, I perish. It means going into the king's chamber without permission can be a deadly activity. And the last queen lost her head. So maybe I'm going to throw caution to the wind. And this statement is about what happens to me physically. The Talmud doesn't want to read it that way. The Talmud wants to understand that Esther was actually once married. And when she was conscripted into the king's harem, she's forced against her will, as are all the other girls. And so if she has to spend the night with the king, in Jewish terms, that's rape, and she can't be held responsible for that. And so spiritually, she's still on solid ground. But now, and I don't want to teach you to read too much into that, into how Esther goes into Achashverosh's chamber, but there's a way to read that which is highly seductive. And now she is initiating an amorous relationship with a non-Jewish man. And that's not what we tend to teach in Beis Yaakov, right? That's not our playbook. But this is a unique situation. Esther her job is to save the Jewish people. And what she basically says is, Kasher avadti avadti, is as I am lost, I am lost. It means, if I am to perish, I am to perish. It means I am giving up on my dreams. A woman who marries the king, especially a non-Jewish king, she's not. You don't have there is no second marriage after that. If you think Esther, decided at the end of the Megillah, after the taxes have been levied and all that stuff, she turns around to Achashverosh and she says, Roshi, it's been really nice, but I really want to marry a guy who studied in Kollel. I'm looking to be the Rebbitzin of the young Israel of Mecca, whatever. Then it is that's not what happens. There isn't. First of all, in general, after nobody marries the king's wife after the king dies. That's sort of if you were married to the king, you're sort of sacrosanct. Nobody does that anymore. In addition, in Jewish law, she is not permitted to return to her husband after that. Esther this is a one-way street for Esther. This is a street by which Esther goes and sacrifices herself for the entirety of the Jewish people. That she has to use a polite term, entertain the king enough to ensure that she has his attention. And if you think that that's not really what happens, have you ever wondered why, Esther goes into the king and he says, tell me whatever you want, you can have half of my kingdom. I would have said, okay, well, give me 30 legions of the army under my direct control and I'll protect the Jews, right? Sounds like a good deal. But she doesn't ask for that. What does Esther ask for? She asked for a second party. That's what you're asking for? Second party? And at the second party, all she does is she points the finger at Haman. Why couldn't you do that at the first party? So again, the Talmud steps in and says, you know why there were two parties? Because at the first time, Esther makes this whole big deal. She sort of, if you will, she entertains Achashverosh, and she tells him, I want to have a party with Haman. And then at that party, she invites Haman to a second party. And then it's sort of, and the Talmud actually says this, she puts the idea in Achashverosh's head that she's got a thing going for Haman. And she's brilliant because she's not going to fight Haman on regular politics. She's not fighting him on national policy vis-a-vis the Jews. She's not even fighting him on matters of the treasury. She's just fighting him on good old bedroom politics. She's making Achashverosh think that Haman is trying to encroach on his turf by taking the queen. And for that, Haman has no defense. And so the villain of the story goes down, outmaneuvered by a woman. But she is playing with a whole different kind of fire that you don't think she's playing with. And she plays with that to her own, in a way, her own self-destruction. It is a story about remarkable selflessness. It is a story about the remarkable selflessness of Esther. This is not the story that we tell our young children. And I want to emphasize, though, that this is a, when you go back to looking at the Esther, Joseph, Daniel rubric, you see that her challenge is silence, and she meets that challenge with a tremendous roar, right? She is a lioness in how she steps up and articulates for her people. There is, though, one very interesting wrinkle in the Megillah that I think deserves a little bit more discussion. And this is that the decrees of the king are and this is another part of that irony. They're ridiculous. The first decree is that you can kill all the Jews on this date, the 13th of Adar. Then the decree is the Jews can defend themselves. He can't take the first one back. He forgets that he made such a decree. Then he says, well, but I can't reverse it. So what are they supposed to do? So, okay, I'll give you permission to defend yourselves. Well, they probably wouldn't have been able to defend themselves anyway. So where do we come to? Where's the salvation to the Jews? So the interesting thing is that the salvation to the Jews comes from the fact that we're told that the Jewish people on those days, what did they do? Here, you can see it, by the way. It happens. This is. I'm sorry I didn't put it up on a slide, but this is chapter 9, verse 16. Sorry. It is chapter 9, verse 16, but that's the one. Oh, so sorry. Chapter 9, verse 2. It says, Nikahalu ha-Yehudim ba'arihem b'chol medinot hamelech. And the Jews gathered together. They became a community. They became a unified fighting force. It was in the unification that the Jews gained the upper hand. Their organization gives them this power. And then, in case you missed that, in chapter 9, verse 2, fast forward to chapter 9, verse 16, and it tells you that specifically, Vayikalu ha-Yudim asher b'Shushan, the Jews in the capital also gathered together, right? And they had to do that on the second day, on the 14th. And then it'll tell you a third time that the Jews of Shushan gathered together, and they became a community. This is what brings Purim to what I call the hyper-local celebration. of all holidays, Purim has a demand to be hyper-local. First of all, there's no other holiday in the entire Jewish calendar that can be observed on 2 different days. Passover is no. If you're in Australia, you're in Jerusalem, you're in Alaska, you're in Lithuania. Passover is always the 15th of Nisan. Period. End of story. Purim, though, if you live in Tel Aviv, it's on the 14th of Adar, and if you live in Jerusalem, it's on the 15th of Adar. And so it's the only holiday that has 2 separate days, and that's by design. In fact, the Mishnah in Megillah says there are 4 different days. The idea is that your community has to celebrate it together, and it's dependent on where you lived. And the mitzvot, you have to send food to people who you can deliver it to within, if you will, a walking reach. You have to support the poor of your community, and you also have to invite people together to eat with you. And just in case you missed what you should be doing at that Suda, you're supposed to be drinking, because remember, I said that food, and especially drink, is the WD-40 of social interaction. And so we sort of double down on that idea. But the beauty of the Megillah is that Hashem puts all the pieces in place, right, for the safety and salvation. But in the end, He leaves a piece over for us to gather together on our own. Okay, so where did we go? This is going to be the really quick review of the whole picture. We started by noting that, Achashverosh, or the word the king, appears 200 times in the Megillah. God seems to be absent. And that there was the Septuagint even has a version where God is mentioned a lot, which means that the Megillah had to work hard to get rid of God. And Achashverosh is the main character, and it seems to be, focused on the monetary policy of his kingdom. And that seems to be the first lens that we're going to look at. And that everyone in the Megillah has its counterpart. Vashti has Esther, Haman has Mordechai. But God and Achashverosh sort of are wrestling, if you will, for the control of the Megillah. And we see that there are a lot of interesting comparisons between Hashem as lawgiver and Achashverosh as sort of this mock, this tomfool of legality. But we see that there's also this parallel with entering their chambers. And so we're sort of left grappling, how do I understand this story where God seems to be missing but is lurking in the background? And we then bring this to this sort of gut check moment where Esther is said, the one thing you can count on is that God will save the Jewish people. And we saw how this rubric, that the challenge of Esther is silence, is to be silenced, if you will, by the confusion of the Achashveroshes, or the what seems to be an act on a political stage. But the irony will undercut Achashverosh, and will undercut Haman, and it will undercut even Esther. But ultimately, we will see that Esther comes to understand that the plan is God's plan, and she will do more than just break the silence. She will stand up for her people, but she also knows that she has to take it one step further. God may have put all the pieces in place, but in the end, the Jews are going to have to rally together and summon the strength from their own communities to bind together as a community to finish the job that God has given them the ability to do. And she will heroically and in a self-sacrificing manner give cover to the Jewish people, organize their ability to coalesce, and unfortunately walk off into the sunset without being able to reap the full rewards of Jewish family. So hopefully that gives us the book of Esther is anything but a simple book. I hopefully that comes across to a certain extent. That it is quite a powerful literary tool, which brings in contrast the dizzying politics that appear on the front face of the Megillah, and the sort of the deep sense of faith and mission and purpose that happen on the back end of the Megillah, which is really, if you will, it's a timeless lesson. Okay, so with all of that, we will happy to take questions or discussion, etc.
Rabbi, I have a question and a comment.
Sure.
Can you explain, what did you mean when you say in the Septuagint God's name is mentioned 50 times? Is that in the earliest editions of the Megillah?
No. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Bible. So when they translated the original Bible into Greek, God's name appeared in the Megillah 50 times. Does that make sense?
But the Megillah wouldn't have been around in the time of the Septuagint, I would have thought.
Okay. There are two different potential dates for the time of Achashverosh. One would be just after Cyrus the Great. It's the Persian period. So one would be just after Cyrus the Great. The other one would be after the Darius and the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Those are the two possibilities. Alexander the Great conquers Israel from the Persians, right? And so Ptolemy is a descendant of the, he's maybe 100 years after Alexander the Great. So it's well after the story of the Megillah. Okay, and you had a comment.
Yeah, my comment was, you said that it was a completely meaningless law that Achashverosh institutes about what did you say, the men being dominant in the family home or something along those lines. But don't we do the same thing? We've got a few laws in the Torah that are never going to be enforced or acted upon, but it's to prove a point or to teach a lesson.
Which ones are you referring to?
That the wayward son will get stoned to death.
Okay, so I would tell you that the way I understand the wayward son is it's actually in Roman law, for example, the wayward son could be executed by a father. In other words, the old Bill Cosby routine, not no kudos to Bill Cosby, but he used to say this: I brought you into the world, I can take you out. That was actually law. So the law of the stubborn and rebellious son was a protection for ADD children who drove their parents crazy. Right? So that's not a theoretical law. And I will tell you, I also think the Sota was the same thing. Right? Honor killings are still a thing in Pakistan. You want to do an honor killing in Torah law? Okay. Go find the Kohen Gadol, go through this whole practice, and there's all these roadblocks before you get to any kind of negative outcome.
That's it. Okay.
Okay. But it still seems to me that he wanted to prove a point, whether he was going to act on it or not. Men are dominant in the family, and women.
Des, how you police? What is the enforcement strategy on this law?
I grant you that there probably was none, but he was making a point that
Let me ask you a question. Do you really think that that's there as evidence of a wise and well-counseled law? Maybe forget that point. Just forget that point for a moment. He turns to Esther and says, "Who made this law?" Right, about exterminating the Jews. And you know what the answer to that question is? You did, hubby.
Yeah.
You made that law. You just forgot about it. Right? His legal policy is not well considered. This is not Immanuel Kant, nor is it Blackstone, right? Right. It's not, This is not a searing legal mind.
I'll go into that. Thank you.
Okay, pleasure. Well, Purim Sameach, everyone. Next week, we will tackle this an even more difficult topic. We're going to look at the Megillah as a prototype for anti-Semitism then and now. So, some interesting overlaps on that front. Okay.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Welcome.